How's it going, everyone? It's Mostrino here. As you can probably tell by the title, today I'm going to be breaking down my Snowblind remix. Now, a few disclaimers before I really get into this. One is that I'm probably not going to play any sections in full just because this is such a heavy project file and it's caused so many problems with my computer that on top of recording it, I'm sure that most of the sections probably won't play properly. So hopefully you're already familiar with the remix and how it sounds. And also, I'm probably not going to break down every element in its complete detail, but hopefully, regardless, you're able to get a lot out of this and maybe notice some elements in the remix that you weren't able to pick up on when just listening to the whole thing. But yeah, here we are. Here is the project file in its complete glory. And without further ado, let's just get right into it, starting off with the intro. So in the intro, I'm playing the original iconic melody on the piano here. And for the piano, I'm using the UVI Model D piano. And if you guys don't actually know this, if you have FL Studio, this plugin is actually included in the free tier of FL Cloud that everyone gets. So if you have FL Studio, you can actually use this plugin, which is great because I feel like it worked perfectly for the piano here. And I'm just throwing on some EQ and reverb for the effects. On top of this, I have like some chimes and other effects to kind of lead you into the intro. And to create like that note that you hear playing, also some other effects, I have some reverb, EFX refract, which basically is like making copies of the sound in different octaves. But as I was saying, to make that like tone, I literally just have a peak like boosted super high on this EQ, which I believe is playing F sharp, which is the root note of the key. Beyond that, I've got some ocean ambience to kind of just fill out the background. Just playing very softly. And later on, I also throw in some thunder. And then I decide to just kind of take it back, make it more minimal. The piano just only starts playing the chords. And here's where I bring in the vocals. Now I do something really interesting with the vocals here. So here's how the vocals sound originally without any effects.
I'm running away from the past I left behind.
And then here's after this main effect that I added. Take a listen.
I'm running away from the past I left behind.
You hear how it sounds like a lot more breathy than it did before? Well, the way that I did this, I tried using like a bunch of different plugins to see if I could just do it by itself, but I couldn't really find a plugin that worked well for how I wanted it to sound. So the way I ended up going about it is I recorded myself doing the vocals in an extremely breathy voice. And then with the main vocals here, what I did is I split it into two layers using spectral compressor as a spectral gate. So one of the layers just has the strongest frequencies, and those are coming through unaffected.
I'm running away from the past I left behind.
What I'm doing here is kind of like what I did in the spectral stretching video, where in that video, I used spectral gate to split a signal into the tonal and atonal parts of the signal. I'm doing a similar thing where I'm using spectral compressor to split it into the strongest frequencies and then the rest like the weaker frequencies. So the strongest frequencies are just coming through normally. And then for these other weaker frequencies, what I'm doing is I'm using morph, as you see here, to morph the original vocal stem with my breathy vocals so that you get a breathier sound. So when you throw these together,
I'm running away from the past I left behind.
like you can definitely hear a difference with the tone of the voice. And then on top of that, I just have some other EQs to kind of accentuate what's going on there. Some no TT,
I'm running away
reverb,
from the past I left behind.
and also some delay to fill out these empty gaps.
I'm running away from the past I left behind. looking for a...
And then for the main, or like the second half of the intro, then I just let the vocals come in normally because it is a much stronger section, so I'm not worried about them sounding soft and breathy. And for the most part, I'm processing them the same way. There's some differences that I'll go over, but one thing that I am doing that I think is worth noting is if any of you guys have messed with the vocal stems, you might notice that there were some parts where the vocals were kind of clipping. And I tried so many different ways to get rid of the clipping, but the problem is that the distortion, not only is it baked into the stem, but it's not technically clipping because it's not like, the problem isn't it going over zero. It's just that somehow it's distorting into the mic itself. So when I tried like Edison declipper and a bunch of these declipping plugins, none of them would do anything about it because it wasn't going over zero. But it was still really obvious to me and I wanted to tame it. So the way that I ended up trying to do that is I just used EQs to kind of duck out the frequencies where the distortion was the most obvious. So if you take a look here, without the EQs, originally the vocal sounds like this.
I'm lost in the music, can I stay here for the night? I promise I'll be gone in the...
Like especially this gone, I feel like it's very obvious.
Promise I'll be gone in the...
And then here's what I'm doing with the EQ.
I'm lost in the music, can I stay here for the night? I promise I'll be gone in the morning, out of sight.
So it's still definitely audible if you're listening more closely, but I feel like this made enough of a difference to where with all of the other elements, it was much less of an issue. Speaking of which, let's go over the other elements that appear at this point. So as far as vocal processing goes, I don't only have the vocals there, but I'm also vocoding it in 3 different ways. What I'm doing here is I have both vocal synth, pitch monster, and morph all doing vocoding. So I'll isolate these one at a time. Here's what the vocal synth sounds like. So that's, again, just Isotope's vocal synth. Then here's Devious Machine's Pitch Monster. So while vocal synth does vocoding, Pitch Monster, what it does is it, instead of it vocoding it to any signal, what it does with the vocals is it just makes copies of the vocals and repitches them to play the different notes that you send through it. So instead of vocoding, you actually just get like a harmony effect. So take a listen to this.
I'm lost in the music,
and I'm turning the format shift down.
I promise I'll be gone in the morning.
And then finally, Synaptic Morph.
I'm lost in the music, can I stay here for the night?
Which, as you might know, does like that FFT-based morphing that in some cases just sounds like a really high-quality vocoder. So when we throw all those together, plus the original vocals, you get this.
I'm lost in the music, can I stay here for the night?
I feel like you get a really nice full sound. Moving on to the instruments, I have the pianos that I had before, but then I'm introducing a bunch of other elements like this choir. Which I'm using the Jacob Collier Audience Choir for Contact, which is free. Then I've got like sustained group strings here. Which is 4 different layers. I've got violins from BBC Symphony Orchestra Discover, which to my knowledge is also free. I've got violins too, violas, and cello, all just playing notes in different octaves, moving around with the velocities to try and create a nice full sound. And also something that I'm doing to make the strings even more dynamic is I have this little volume automation. So you get like some swells here. And then the other layer are these solo strings, which these are from Philharmonic, which had a promotion where they were giving it away for free. So that's when I got this one. And it's going through the same volume automation, and it gives you like a nice solo violin layer on top. And for these real instruments, a lot of the times, instead of using something like Valhalla Supermassive, which I tend to use for reverbs, especially for like synths, when I want to get a more realistic sounding reverb, I usually prefer to use a convolver. So in this case, I'm using Kilohertz convolver with one of the preset impulses, the Sports Center one, because without it, you still get a really nice sound, but this convolver just completely puts it in a new space. Also for instruments, I've got these brass layers. These are both also from Symphony Orchestra Discover. I've got bass trombones and tuba, and these sound like this. And then finally, I have these bells. I have this Celeste from, again, Symphony Orchestra Discover, and these bells from Labs, which is also free, or at least this pack for Labs is free. And these sound like this. So all together. I feel like you get a really nice full sound, and I feel like the fullness of the sound is even more accentuated by the fact that it was so minimal before, with just, the piano, the vocals, and this ambience. Beyond that, I have similar effects like before, as well as some other sweeps and impacts. And then in this second half, I also bring in a riser. And I'll go over that last part in just a second. First, let me talk about these pads, which is a pad I made in Faceplant, as well as a pad that comes in Labs. Here's the Faceplant one. And here's the Labs one. Again, just kind of filling out some more space. But yeah, now moving on to this little break before the synths come in. I also have this bass playing. This is made in Faceplant. And you can see here, I'm just modulating this phase modulation amount, this filter table, and this filter as well. As well as the frame, just to kind of get this opening and closing, and also this tape stop effect you hear at the very end as well. And then, like I mentioned, I have this sound here too, which is a couple of different layers. Part of it is this cashmere sample, like this air pluck. And all of this, I'm running through a snap heap here that's both panning it around and doing a tremolo. So the way that it's doing it is doing a tremolo, so it's doing like this volume modulation that slows down, but it's panning it in a way so that every other time that the volume goes up, the sound is panned left, and then the other times it's panned right. So it sounds like this. And you can also see that I'm modulating the depth of the panning as well. Like at first, it's just tremolo, no panning, and then it pans up and slowly pans back down. So that's one of the layers. And then these other layers, I actually made from the trance lead stem that they gave from the original track, but it sounds completely different. So here's how it sounds with all the tremolo stuff. I believe there is probably some spectral gate here, maybe some EFX refraction. I remember I threw it into Faceplant's granular generator and messed with the pitch and some other stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of transform the sound to get this little effect in here to kind of take us from the end of the intro into this part with, the melody and all these chords. So let's break this section down next. So we have this lead here. The way that this lead gets like such a gritty sound is normally it would just sound like a saw wave. if you modulate a saw or a square with something like a triangle wave where there's no harmonic, this is just a fixed 70 hertz triangle wave, the more you modulate it, you get like this really gritty sound because it's essentially doing a really fast vibrato. You can hear it become more intense as I turn it up. So I thought that this was kind of the sweet spot. And then I also layer it with just a regular saw, as well as a super saw. And then as far as effects go, you can hear that I have this reverb that only comes in when the notes stop playing, just to fill in the empty gaps. And also to make it so wide, because you hear it's not really that wide before, I'm doing some mid-side no TT. So not only does it bring up the frequencies, but I'm also bringing up the frequencies of the sides by themselves. So it has more of a dramatic effect. And then you heard I have some little fills here. I'll play these along with the bass fills that I made for this as well. So this is just kind of to fill out the empty gaps in between these chords, which, speaking of the chords sound like this. Three layers. One of them is actually one of the saws that I used in the Fall Nightmare remix. Another layer is actually the super saw I used in All In My. And the third layer is a remake of the Au5 super saw killer chords that he made in Serum. One of the users in the Kilohertz Discord remade it for Phase Plant. So I got that preset and processed it a bit, and it sounds like this. But you'll notice, not only just in the chords, but in general, you'll notice that there are a lot of presets from songs that I made in the past, which is actually the reason why I even opened this project file up in the first place, is to save the things that I made for this song as presets. Because once I started doing it, it really just made the process so much faster. It's something that I really recommend because I noticed that beforehand, I would be making, super saws for like the 12th time, and it's just the same thing as every other time. Whereas if I know that there's a specific sound that I want now, and I know that I've already made it, like for instance, I just want, big super saw chords, I can just go through and have them right away and just tweak them if I need, but it can make the whole process a lot faster. I'm also doing the same vocoding with the vocals that I did last time, but what I'm doing now that I think is also worth noting is to make the vocoding even tighter. I actually am automating the volume of the vocode layer so that it more obviously cuts out when Tasha stops singing.
Snowblind, out of sight and out of mind.
So you get this really tight vocode layer. Then I just have this bass to help fill out the chord stack and make it even bigger. And this bass is also a preset from a project that I've already made. So when we put these two together, you get this really nice big sound. Also, I just throw in some more effects for impact. And towards the end, I add this little lead as kind of like a harmony to what Tasha's singing here. And if we take a look at this lead, it's just a super square with a little bit of phase modulation from this sine wave and some vibrato as well. Also in the second half, I bring in these claps to kind of keep the energy going, as well as these little fills towards the end of these sections. And these claps are two layers, both of which I made in Phase Plant. That's a dry one I made in Faceplant, and this one I threw in some super massive to make it sound really big. Called it a stadium clap. And I feel like these two sound really full together personally. And then at the very end, I have like this harder bass with these chords to transition us into the buildup. So moving on to the buildup, first we've got, of course, you know, the buildup drums getting faster and faster. I'm filtering these snares. And then I just wanted to add a bunch of different little layers and elements to kind of keep your attention and make the build not sound too empty. So one of the things that I added is this ARP. Just kind of opening up over time, just another like little thing for you to focus on. I have this bass playing as well as some fills, both some fills from the drop as well as some fills from the original bass stems. I also have these strings, again, just another element to fill out the buildup. Sound kind of goofy on their own because I'm using kind of like a volume modulation to accentuate how staccato they are, but I feel like it fits much more in the context of the whole buildup. And as you can hear, it kind of rises there. And then also to layer on with that bass playing, I have these vocal chops just kind of following the rhythm, which is from the original vocal stem, but I do a little bit of processing that makes a difference. Really, I think it's two main things that make the difference. If I turn these off, it sounds like this, which more or less just sounds like how the vocal sounds. But I have this flanger filter from Serum 2. And then the one that's really making the difference is I'm using the Kilohertz ring mod. And you can hear how that changes the tone of the vocals. And then finally, to fill things up, I've just got a bunch of effects for the buildup. And that's pretty much the entirety of the build, aside from this little bit at the end where I just have this rising bass, this rising low piano that you also hear in the original right before the drop, and the vocals vocoded to this really low note, which I believe is just Synaptic Morph in this case. But yeah, that gets us to the drop. So starting off with the drop, I'll just solo the drums, but there's not too much happening here. Really just kick, snare, rides. I have these chords that play. And I think maybe the one thing worth pointing out with these chords is that to get this kind of like flanger effect, well, for one, I'm stacking a bunch of ensembles, but I feel like the main thing that does it is I actually have this convolver with no impulse, but the feedback turned up, and I'm modulating the delay. So if I turn this off versus with it on, you can hear that that flanger kind of sound coming in. I also have a bass layered onto it as well, and also the vocal coming through, and some effects for texture. And then, as you were hearing the beginning of this little bass fill, and then we get the main bass of the first part of the drop, which with all of the elements sounds like this. So let's go ahead and break this down. So let's just start with the bass part. This is 3 layers, I believe. Actually 4 layers. All right, so here's the first layer. I've got this saw I made, which if I turn off all of the effects, at first it just sounds like a saw with a sub, but I throw on some Note TT and then this shaper table, which is really making most of the difference, as well as you can see, a ton of dispersers. But if I just turn off the shaper table and these dispersers, it still just sounds like a saw, just with like a bunch of compression on it. But then with the shaper table, I give it some movement by modulating the drive. And then, of course, you get this super dispersed sound once I re-enable these dispersers at the end. And then, on top of that, I'm just slamming it with some Note TT and a little bit of EQ. Then, the second layer is this just kind of like Reese sounding bass. And then I have these two layers. This is actually the same sound that plays right after for the fill, so I'll break this down there. And then there's this layer, which is this sound. So I start off with just some wavetables, but I believe that it's this filter Buenas Noches, which is a banger name, by the way. I believe it's this filter table that makes that one kind of low harmonic so strong, because without it, it does have a completely different sound, but once you throw this in, you can see that one harmonic really come through. And I feel like that makes for a really nice effect of just bringing it in and out with this other bass. I feel like you get a really cool rhythm. Because then you can see that harmonic coming in and out, whereas the sub is sustained the whole way through. Because originally, I was actually just going to have it do like this quarter note rhythm. Originally, the drop was going to sound like this. But I just wasn't really feeling it, so I kept trying to mess around with it and see if I can get an idea that I really liked. Which thankfully, I'd rendered these layers out to audio, because when I had them in the MIDI, the disperser wasn't like resetting with every new note. So when I had it in the audio, I guess at some point I just thought of just changing the rhythm. And then when I made it this rhythm, then I really started getting into it. But I still wanted to kind of beef it up and make it sound even bigger. So I have this kind of quiet lead layer, as well as these arps playing, which almost sounds like a yaoi bass just because of like the notes that I chose here. The sound itself isn't really that interesting. I just have these sine waves and I'm using this convolver to give it a bit more texture. If I take that out, you get a much more standard sound. So this convolver is kind of doing a lot of the heavy lifting. But yeah, really a big part of it is just the notes that give it that kind of vowel-y sound. And of course, it's matching the rhythm of these shorter basses that come in. I also have these chords kind of following that rhythm as well. And also a dispersed version of the vocal following that rhythm. And some effects. So again, once you throw these all together, you get that main sound. Followed up by this fill. So the way that I made this sound, so the first sound is just this. I was messing around with this earlier to make the main bass, because like I mentioned, this is one of the layers. And I originally had this sound. But somehow, one way or another, I noticed that if I put this really like sharp filter before slamming it with distortion, as I moved around the filter peak, you get a bunch of really cool sounds. So I'm like, okay, what if I just like mess around with the modulation and have it move around really fast to get this nice fill? So that's exactly what's happening. If I even just change the cutoff, you get a completely different sound. So these were just the notes that I kind of settled on. And I just ended off with this other sound, just to give it a bit of variation and make it a bit more interesting. And I also layer that last sound with this sample, which is actually the original song's piano ran through like a ton of reverb and then compressed. So when we put these two together, you get that fill. Then we have this sound, which is also just a bunch of layers. I've got this same aggressive arp and this bass, which I believe I'm doing some morphing with these chords. But let's just break down the little layers happening here. So with the chords by themselves, I've got these same like flanger type chords that I was playing before. And then these are the ones that I believe I'm doing the morphing with. that I get like some really weird texture with these degrade filter tables. And yeah, as you can see, I'm running it through spectral compressor with one of the base layers. So I'll talk about that in a second. But as far as the other base layers go, I've got this. I've got this sound, which again is literally just the same one as the fill, except I'm just holding it at a certain part of the filter. Sub. And then here's the main bass that I'm using spectral compressor on with the chords. So this is, I guess, some kind of weird growl that I made. As well as some glitches that I made ages ago by using like some artifacts from OTT that I'm just kind of layering in to fill out the frequencies. And then just a little bass fill, and then back to the main bass. And then I have this sound, which I think is pretty cool, so I'll break this one down in a bit more detail. So there's a few layers. I've got these chords here, which is just a regular superstar, but then the main part of the sound is this bass, which we have 3 layers here. Sub, this little phaser type bass, and then the main bass, which is this guy. So there's 2 things that kind of make this bass sound like how it does, because if I turn these 2 plugins off, it sounds like this. And this is, for the most part, just coming straight out of Phase Plant. So one of the things that makes it sound like how it does is vocodex. But the way that I'm introducing the vocodex here is I have 2 parts of the signal. One is just dry, and the other one is ran through vocodex, where I'm using the sound both as the modulator and the carrier. I'm not vocoding it to anything else. And the way that I'm getting that metallic resonant sound is by turning the bandwidth all the way down. And how I'm introducing the vocodex is I'm using a frequency splitter. So the low end is dry and the high end is the vocodex sound. And as I slowly turn down the frequency of the cutoff, more and more of the high end becomes that vocodex sound. So it sounds like this. But then the other element that really contributes to its sound is the Serum 2 comb filter, where I'm messing with the resonance and the cutoff. So when I turn this on, I feel like it gives it a nice little tone versus how it is without it. And then this is the same chord as before, except instead of having the delay time go up, I have it go down. Then I have just another bass fill. And then same main bass, I have this little fill, which is 3 layers. There's this explosive sub drop, which I actually first made for my Chroma remix. This sound I'll break down in a second. And then just more bass glitches as layers. But as far as this main sound goes, so part of it is this kind of goofy sounding growl. But I'm actually using spectral compressor with this other bass as the input. And actually, since I think this is a kind of cool sound, I'll break down how I made this really quickly. So first, I just have this overtone scanner preset wavetable in Phase Plant, which already sounds cool to begin with. But what I'm really doing to make it sound even more spectral is I'm using this metallic low pass filter table without it. With it, it sounds like this. So you can hear all of like those high end frequencies coming through. And then the other layer is actually this same filter table, wavetable, but as a wavetable. And I'm using some phase modulation from a saw wave to kind of turn down the formants a bit. And running this through a bunch of effects. So when I combine both of them, you get this. So when I use spectral compressor to morph that sound with this sound, you get this. Which you can kind of hear how it sounds kind of low quality on its own, which is why I put it with all these other layers so that it sounds a lot nicer. And then afterwards, I just have these big chord stacks with some bass to fill it out, where the fills are actually from the original bass stem. And a little 808 at the end. The lead. The vocals.
Just for tonight, let your thoughts be free.
Which, as you can hear, I have this layer on the vocals, like this pitch down layer, which is made using Pitch Monster. But not only am I using Pitch Monster, if I turn off these other effects, originally the layer just sounds like this.
Just for tonight, let your thoughts be free.
Where it's just pitched down an octave and formant shifted down 9 semitones. But then to make it a bit more metallic, I have the comb and flanger filters. And then no TT to bring it up. And then finally, just crushing it with distortion. And then with the main vocal.
Just for tonight, let your thoughts be free.
And then tons of reverb to fill out that next section. And finally, I also have this piano playing to fill it out as well. Just this bright piano with tons of reverb. The second part of this first half of the drop is pretty similar to what we already went over. I just add some more stutters to the bass fills. And then, of course, there's a little variation with the main bass sound compared to when it usually sounded like this. So to make this variation, I just changed some of the different layers a little bit, like for instance, this lead now plays this. One of the layers that originally plays this, now I just changed the cutoff of that like very tight bandpass filter and sounds like this. And I believe I changed the vocals as well. Before the vocals sound like this, and now they sound like this. So pretty minor differences, but I feel like it's definitely enough to be noticeable. But also similar enough to still feel like it belongs with the first part of the drop. Same thing, just minor differences in the fills. Like it's the same sound, but now I'm picking different frequencies for the cutoff of the filter. Same thing here, I'm just adding like some more glitches, more fills. This one I also want to talk about because even though it's almost the exact bass as the earlier one, I feel like it's worth noting how I made the variation for it to sound like this time around. And really, it's in the same two parts of the bass that I was talking about last time. It's these two layers. If I turn these off, it sounds almost the same. But one of the things that I change is instead of having the bandwidth turned all the way down, now I actually have the bandwidth turned way up. And unfortunately, you actually can't automate the number of bands, which I actually changed as well. So I just had to have a completely different vocodex instance. But now you can hear the difference where with the vocodex, instead of sounding like this, it now sounds like this. So a lot less metallic and a lot more aggressive. And I also change up some of the settings on the comb filter. So that gives it some more variation as well. Again, just some more glitches and variations on these bass fills. And this time I also change up this last sound. Now the main layer sounds like this, which is both this really phaser heavy bass. So that's literally how I get the whole sound, is just stacking a bunch of phasers. If I turn this off, it's just a wavetable, but these phasers make all the difference. And I'm also running it through some spectral compressors and EQs as well, just to bring the other frequencies back up. And then this other layer, if you guys don't know, Faceplant has a bunch of these different unison modes. And this hard unison mode, normally if you detune a saw, it sounds like this. And in this case, I'm pitching it down. But when you use this hard unison mode, there's no variation in the phases of the different voices. It's like if you turn the phase random all the way down in Serum, you get the same effect. So you actually get the voices start to phase with each other since they're pitched slightly differently. So I run this through a bunch of effects. But to get that phasing to be even more obvious, I actually put global unison on top of the unison of the oscillator so that there's even more phasing. So when you put these two together, you get kind of this cool, like, pitching down effect. And then for this little break here, I have this reverse reverb fading into the chords. This bass, which is actually the same one from right before the drop. I'm playing some of the basses from the original bass stem, just to kind of fill things out as well. This super bright reverb piano as well, playing a little melody towards the very end, as well as these bells adding onto that melody. And of course the vocals, which I bit crushed towards the end.
Just for tonight, would you come with me?
As well as other effects, but in particular I have these airy reverb plucks, which are a Kashmir sample, that I also pitch around as an additional melody. So when you put these together with the instruments, you really get like a lot of melodic things to focus on. And then we transition into the second half of the drop. After filtering in these snares, I start adding more rise to fill things out. And one of these layers, I have some pretty heavy wave shaping going on to make it sound a lot crunchier. Normally it sounds like this, but with the wave shaper. And then moving on to the main melodic elements, I have this little watery type ARP that's playing, which is also from my Chroma remix. I just have this drum hit where I'm randomizing the notes, but it's always playing a minor chord, as well as some reverb on top of it. I have these chords. I feel like what's making these chords sound so interesting, it's these two layers. This is a more or less normal sounding chord. It has some convolver to kind of make the texture a bit more interesting. But these I feel like are the really interesting sounding ones. And I feel like it's all down to the processing. If I turn this off, it's literally just a really short chord stab. But if we go through the processing here, I start off with EFX Refract, again, to just spray these different layers that playing at different octaves. Okay, nothing crazy yet. Some EQ, boosting the highs. Some no TT, so it makes those quieter elements a lot more noticeable. So you can kind of start to hear the glitchiness come in. Then I have this snap heat filter table also changing the texture. And then a bunch of these filters from Serum 2, sample and hold, format filter, and notch filter. And then finally, what's tying it all together is the no TT, again, bringing all of the elements up, and then distortion and some more filtering. So putting these two together, you get kind of this really cool chord sound to complement these basses. I think this is one of the coolest sounds in my opinion in the whole remix, so I definitely want to break this down. I'm not going to break down these little fills because they're kind of just variations of the main bass, but if we talk about this main bass here. So for one of the layers is just a sub, so there's not much to talk about there, so let's just focus on the other layer. So I start off with this aliasing wavetable, which is, again, one of the preset wavetables you have in Phase Plant, which already sounds pretty interesting, but to change the timbre, I phase modulate it with this complex FM wavetable. So you can already hear kind of the main vowel sound that I rely on for the main bass, but still there's a big difference between this and this. So let's break down the effects. So first, no TT, distortion. But then to get that metallic ringy high end, I'm using the Spectral Notches preset in Filter Table. Take a listen to this. So you can hear how that changes the high end. Makes it a lot more metallic and a lot less noisy. Then to accentuate the vowel sound, I'm using the Format filter. More no TT. Comb filter to widen it. More no TT. And then a little bit of convolver to add some reverb and taking out the lows. And then, like I said, these other fills are just variations of the same preset, where sometimes I mess around with like the position of the format filter or the frame of the wavetable. So you get these variations. And aside from just like some other effects that I've sprinkled in here, that's pretty much it. By the way, to make these effects, I actually have quite a lot going on here. If I take off the effects, it sounds nothing like how it does in the final version. Without any effects, it sounds like this. Which, these are actually sampled from Bionicle the game, and I could not find like a YouTube video that sampled these sounds. So to get it, just for this remix, I downloaded the game and then opened it up and just recorded all of the sounds and imported it in as a file so that I could resample it to get some cool effects here. So again, I'm just pitching it around. But afterwards, what I do is I run it through some spectral gate. Once I run it through the snap heap, that's both having like a little layer pitch shifted up, as well as just a bunch of no TTs to bring all of like the spectralness out, you'll hear how much of a difference it makes. And then just some EQ to get rid of the low end. Then I have this, which I'm also pretty happy with. So let's break this down. First, these chords. But now let's talk about the main sound here. 2 layers. One of them, on one hand, it is just the sub, but it also has this really crunchy noise. So it does add a lot, to be fair. Because when I take this out, the growl just sounds like this. Which I still think is cool, but I feel like it benefits a lot from having the noise. But at any rate, let's talk about this growl. Without any effects, I've got this sine wave with complex FM modulating the wavetable position. Really nothing to write home about. But this snap heap is basically the one that's doing all the work. So I'm going to turn that off for now. Because besides that, I just have no TT, you know, some filtering. It sounds like this. So it's beefing it up a lot. But again, this is what's turning it into this. So what's happening here is basically I've got 2 parallel filters. One of them is an extremely resonant low pass. The other one's an extremely resonant high pass. And also shout out to Nasco for pointing out in particular that you need to have one of the filters be phase inverted. Otherwise, they're going to cancel out when the peaks get close to each other. This is basically completely taken from the setup that Nasco showed. Is you have control of the cutoff here and control of the resonance. But what I'm modulating is the distance between these 2 peaks, which gives it that vowely sound. And you can completely change the vowels by just changing the cutoff here. So you can get some goofier sounds as you move it up. But I eventually decided that this was kind of the sweet spot for me to get that low growly sound. So it's really all from that. Okay, moving on to the next part. A bunch of different samples. Again, we have more of these, just adding like some weird texture and high end. I have some samples to emphasize like the transients. I have a sub and some lasers. But this is the main sound. So to break this down, I have a bunch of wavetables. If I turn off all the effects, again, nothing really to write home about. But let me talk about the main things that are doing the magic. So first of all, for this first layer in lane 1, it's really this first multipass doing all the magic. So if I turn everything else on but leave this off, it's really just what you hear but stronger. But here, I've got this filter table. Again, filter table I feel like has been one of the MVPs, not just for this remix, but for a lot of my sound design in general. It can completely change the tone of different sounds and make them sound so much more metallic and spectral, because turning this off versus on, you can completely hear how it changes the high end. It's the same idea for this one in lane 2. If I turn everything on except for the multipass, you get this. But with the multipass, this time on spectral notches, you get a more resonant high end. And finally, I have this layer with some effects. So when you throw these 3 all together, but the reason why these are bounced out is because after all of that, I'm throwing it through multi-band delay to kind of get some cool frequency dispersion. So that's why it's rendered out now. Then we get this other sound. Again, some glitch layers, but most of it is here. And here's the main sound. Originally, it's this hollow wave table with some phase modulation from a sine wave. But again, just like always, it's filter table coming to save the day, because with everything else on but this off, but as soon as I turn on the filter table, you can hear how it completely changes the texture of the sound. And even I could cycle through these and you get a bunch of different cool variations. So yeah, filter table, OP. Then we get kind of the same repeat of what you hear the first time. We get this moment with the big super saws. Again, it's kind of like what you've heard already. This is also more or less the same, just some slight variations in the chords and lead, as well as a slight variation in the bass. Probably from just like changing the wavetable position and maybe some stuff in the format filter. And this I also get a slight variation by just modulating some of the parameters. In this case, the scale parameter on the multi-band delay to get this little like pitch drift on the bass. Instead of just... So you can hear it kind of slides down at the beginning. And then you get kind of the same thing. And then this section is mostly the same, but I change up the piano melody a little bit, where instead of coming in at the very end, it's more sustained and comes in right away. So this combined with the bells and the airy pluck, you get this. And then now we move into kind of like this post drop where you get the melody coming back in these huge chords. So drums are still doing the same thing. You still get the same big chords from before. With this reverb automation to fill in the gaps. Same bass with a bunch of bass fills, some of which I made and some of which are from the original bass stem. I've got the same bright piano playing the melody. Same with the bells. You of course have the vocals.
Snowblind.
And one of the main elements of this section is the lead. There's a ton of layers to this lead, so let me play this real quick. So first we have the same lead from earlier in the track. Then we have this layer, which is also playing these lower notes. This is basically a supersaw and some noise. Then this layer, which is actually a preset from a lead I've been using for some of my other projects. Just a super distorted lead. And then finally this square lead layer with a little bit of a pitch envelope. And also some mid-side no TT. So throw these all together. And you just get this really huge lead stack. All right, now let's move on to the midsection. I just have a bunch of effects here to kind of transition us out of the drop. And I feel like there are two sounds in particular that I want to talk about. One of them is this sound. What I feel like is cool about this sound is that normally it's just like this fast laser that's slowing down, that I'm panning around. But as you can see, I also have this convolver that's kind of colorizing it, which to get this impulse, I actually used Callan's Purifier script, which is free, so shout out to that. And I slowly make it more and more colorful as time goes on. And I actually also used Purifier earlier for some of these bass fills in the drop. You can see where I automate the convolver. Sometimes I have it be colorful and sometimes not. So that's why that first part is so like tonal. Same thing over here. If I go into here and turn off the convolver, you get the same sound, but you know, like not fitting melodically at all, but the convolver can really do wonders and completely transform it. And the reason why I'm using Purifier, by the way, for these impulses, the difference that it makes is it makes the impulse so tight that you still get all of the texture from the original sound without it sounding like washed out like you get with a lot of these convolver color-based sounds. The other sound that I wanted to break down plays right as you get into the verse here. It sounds like this. This is that same technique of using the hard detune mode on the saw, except this time instead of using it as a fill, I'm using it kind of like as a downlifter to layer with these other effects. I've got a bunch of like these nice little Foleys and glitches in the drums. Some of which are sounds that I've made using Bristow's dynamic Au5 plug data patch. And some of them are just other samples that I processed. But one interesting thing that I want to point out, this snare, you probably notice it has a very tonal tail. And that is because of what I'm doing with this patch. Or if I turn it off, it sounds like this. What I'm doing is I have this color impulse. This is not a Purifier impulse. Like, this is not tight at all. If you just put it on the normal sound, it's going to sound very wet and like muddied out, but it's fine because I'm only putting this through the reverb signal. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm having the wet signal be reverberating this, you know, colorful version of the snare, whereas the dry signal is completely dry, like no color added to it at all. So the dry signal sounds like this, whereas the reverb by itself is just this. So that's why you only hear the colorfulness in the tail. So I feel like it adds a really nice layer without needing to add an extra sample. Like, it's all from the snare. So what's also cool about that is that if I change the snare, the tail is gonna change dynamically. Like if I pitched it down, you hear that that tail changes to match. I also have the vocals at first just vocoded to some low notes, and then later on I vocode them to some chords.
You know when you keep running but your legs are standing still, it's like you're stuck in a nightmare but you keep doing it for the thrill. Well, this is reality, you only live it once, so wake up from your dream. But just for tonight, let the lines get blurred. Let your thoughts be free. Let your thoughts be free.
By the way, when I say vocoding, I mean morph. I'm using Synaptic Morph for this. But yeah, in this case, I'm using the dispersed saw, which is why you get, you know, that cool dispersion on the vocals when I'm morphing them this way. Then I have this respace that I'm opening up with this macro that you can see is linked to just about everything. So take a listen to how this sounds. And then in the second half, I layer it with another respace that I made. To fill things out a bit more, as well as layering in these cool, like glitchy chords. that I'm both panning around and also messing with this filter table. And actually, I'm not really panning them around. What I'm doing is I'm using this channel mixer that's essentially inverting the polarity every 3/8 notes. And as you can hear, there's also this filter going on that's controlled by this LFO too, just to give it even more movement. I have ambience as well as these pads. So here I have like these little breath samples. These airy plucks. And these little other pads that I use as kind of fills. Where I'm using spectral gate to make them sound like more watery towards the very end. And then as far as these pads go, part of them are just the pads that I showed earlier, but this one I think is pretty neat because essentially what I'm doing is I have these sine waves where I'm randomizing their pitch, but I'm running the random through a remap. So even though the pitch is random, it's always playing the F sharp pentatonic minor scale, so it's always going to be in key. And also what I'm doing is I also have this random going to a 50% chance remap on the gain, meaning that there's a 50% chance that it's not going to play anything. So that way it's not just like constantly just playing these random notes, but it has a bit of like a randomized rhythm to it. And then when I throw in the reverser, refract, and supermassive, we get this. So I feel like it adds like a nice little texture in the background. And then finally, let's break down these instruments. So I have this music box playing, but as you can probably tell by the pattern name, it's going into kilohertz reverser, as well as a bunch of other effects like refract, supermassive, pancake to pan it around. But essentially this gives you this like cool little reversed effect. And on top of that, I have these bells, and to get this kind of glitch effect, I probably deleted it at this point, but I ran it through this snap heat preset, Chaos Delay by Outer Lives. And this also, you know, completely messes with the sound, gives it a bunch of like these grain type delays where it's pitched around and sometimes reversed. So this can also give that similar reversed glitchy type effect. Take a listen. But then I really open it up towards the second half with all these other instrument layers that I bring in. So let's break this down really quick. I've got Jacob Collier Audience Choir. Most of these strings are the same as the ones from before. In particular, these legato strings are the same BBC Symphony Orchestra ones that I showed earlier. But then I also throw in these spiccato strings as well to kind of add some more rhythm and just make this section feel a bit more alive. Kind of randomizing the velocity, having not all of the notes hit exactly on the grid or be the exact same length. And I believe to do this, even though you can use the humanized script here to do an effect similar to this, I believe the way I did it in this specific instance is I just actually played the notes in MIDI. So that already kind of did a good job of having the notes have their own little variation. But I feel like an element that's also making a big difference are these solo strings. And these are actually the same solo strings that I had earlier here, but I'll explain in a second why these ones are rendered out, but here's how they sound. So the reason why these strings are rendered out, because it's the same Philharmonic 2 strings, is because I'm using the pitch knob and you can't actually automate this, unfortunately. So I'm recording myself moving the pitch knob, and I feel like it makes it so much more expressive. Because for instance, for these first two notes, playing it like that sounds so much different than playing it like this. So I wanted to get those pitch slides between as many of the notes as I could, so I used the pitch knob and rendered it out to get it to sound like this. I also have the bells adding as a layer. As well as the bell stem from the original stems of the track. So when you throw these all together, I feel like it just sounds so nice and beautiful. That's pretty much it for the midsection here. At this point, I was really like worried about getting it done on time, so I basically made this entire section in just like one day. And really the only other part of this that I haven't talked about yet is this lead that also comes in the second half. This sounds like this. It's essentially just a sine wave with a volume envelope and some reverb. Although it's not quite a sine wave. As you can see, there's a little bit of high-end information, and that's because I am slightly, ever so slightly phase modulating it with this complex FM. All right, but yeah, that really wraps up the bridge, so let's move on to the build-up. So first I have this lead playing the main melody, but it also has kind of like some pitch glides to give it a bit more expression. And the way that I made this sound, it is actually just a sine wave with a ton of no TT. And also I believe that filtering it first can lead to like some weird artifacts, so I'm kind of taking advantage of that as well. But yeah, even though it kind of ends up sounding like a square, it really just is a sine wave with a bunch of no TT. And also some vibrato that opens up for the longer notes. Then I have this kind of trancey sounding arp. What I'm doing for this is I want the high end of the ARP to sound like just one voice, but I still want to get some nice width. So I'm using a detuned saw, but low passing it so that you don't get any of the high end of the detuned saw. It's also an octave up. Whereas most of the high end is just coming from this saw that's an octave lower, where I'm also doing that same trick to make it a bit more gritty of modulating it with this fixed triangle wave. So when you throw these two together, you still get that tight high end, but you get the width and the layer of that octave up super saw. Then some chords. Slowly filtering in. Also have the bass slowly filtering in, as well as a sub drop. And a ton of effects to fill out the build. As well as the pads and ambience continue playing. And finally, these drums. And we end off with this bit crushed lead. which really is just how I describe it. It's just a saw wave with bit crushing and, you know, a bunch of no TT. And then we go right into the second drop. The drums sound like this. So we've got the same ARP from the first drop that sounds kind of like a vowel, as well as these little leads. We've got these chords, as well as like this vowel-y sounding chord, which to make this, I've got two layers. One is actually using the same technique that I used for that growl from way earlier. If I turn off the snap heap, it's just a normal chord, but I'm using these filters to give it that vowel-iness. And then the other layer, what's funny is this is actually originally just a sine wave, but because I'm using the wavetable, there's some artifacts in the high end that are almost unnoticeable at first, but once I bring in a bunch of these no TTs, it becomes way more obvious. So even if I turn off everything else aside from the no TTs, you can hear the high end artifacts start coming in. And then I just have these filters, creating that very subtle vowel movement, chorus to widen it out, and then just some more post-processing. And then all of these sounds are actually just from the original track, just me doing a bunch of like stretching or other type of processing with it to get these fills. Then we have the bass. I think really the one sound worth breaking down is this last one. The rest is just, you know, random sound design to get these bass fills. It's this color bass sound. And the way that I get the color for all of the sounds in this entire track, not just this sound, but all of the sounds, there's no pitch map, there's no retune, there's no chroma, like there's none of like the polyphonic retuning shenanigans. It's a bunch of different techniques depending on the sound. Sometimes it's spectral compressor, sometimes it's convolver like I've shown you already. This time, it's the GOAT. It's filter table. And I'm actually using the focus pentatonic wavetable to just add these harmonics to accentuate the colorfulness of the sound. If I take this out, it's just a normal bass, but with this in, you start getting that colorful resonance. And then I also have these layers. And this one is made using spectral compressor. I'm spectrally compressing it to this sound, which sounds like this. It's basically just a pad, and originally the bass sounds like this. Again, it's using that random flange to get that very spectral sounding high end. And when I spectral compress those two together, as well as add some other effects, you get this. So I'm layering these two sounds together, and that gives you the main colorfulness of the sound. Then I have some other effects. And this is also just being made colorful from the convolver. Normally, it's just this water sample, but then with the convolver, it becomes colorful. It's the same deal for this part. Just some slight variations in the bass. As well as this growl, which is two layers, both of which are made in phase plant. One of them is like the main body of the growl. But then the other layer is actually just this sine wave pitching down with some convolver and other processing. So without it, and then with, just kind of adds a little bit more to the growl. I have that little pad filling things out as well as these other effects. And then we have this little section that I think has a lot of cool sounds in it. So I want to break this down really quick. I already mentioned the drums. I have this very like glittery ARP. The chords are 3 layers. One of them is itself 3 layers. It's just a bunch of chords that I made. And then the other 2 layers are just some random pad samples that I found to match these chords. One of them's panned a little bit left and the other one's panned a little right. So that also adds a bunch of texture to these chords. But one of my favorite sounds, maybe even my favorite sound in this entire remix, is the sound that plays right before it, this guy. Which I actually already broke down this sound. This is the same sine wave, you know, taking advantage of the artifact sound that I had earlier. But when I just have it playing these notes as well as with the little reverb swell, I think it just sounds so nice. And I'm layering it with this bass growl, which is also made colorful through the same filter table technique that I showed for the other one. You see here the focus pentatonic. If I turn this off, you know, it's just a regular growl, but with it on, you get a little bit more of that color in there, and then some other basses to layer on with the chords. I tried not to go too crazy with the bass for this one to really let the chords shine. And then there's also just some other glitches like I've been adding throughout this whole remix just for some more texture. And also the vocals here. What's funny about this is actually only the second one is from the original stem. The first one is just a completely other sample entirely. But I just really wanted to play this note. And since I couldn't really find a moment in the original vocal stem that really fit what I was looking for, I just used this other sample. But since I come in with the original vocal stem in the second half, I feel like it still feels like it belongs. And then just some effects, including this little like spin back at the end. And then we get a bit more of the same, just like a little new glitch in this part. And then these chord parts are similar to how they were before, but there's two noteworthy changes. One is I add this lead. And the other, in this entire chord bus, I go into the EQ, and I have this little peak where I'm modulating the frequency, and you'll hear the effect that this makes. If I turn this off, it sounds like this. Versus with it on, you hear it accentuates different frequencies as I move around the cutoff of that peak. The bass is the same as before, and a little laser at the very end. Same piano, same vocals. And then the second half is also pretty much the same, just with some slight variation on some of the basses. And as you can hear, I kind of switch out some of the parts and notes that I'm using for the chords as well. Also, I brought in the tail of the snare from the first drop for this section. And then I bring in more rides for the next part, just to add the energy. Another difference is in this little break part, I changed the chords. So now we get and also slightly different notes for the vocal chops. And then more or less, more of the same aside from this fill at the very end. Which some of these are actually sounds that you've heard before. But to make it a little bit different, I also add on the new like sine sound that I was showing before. But instead of having it go up like it did earlier, it goes down. Then for this little bit, I also bring back the pluck from the bridge, as well as these chords. But the rest is more or less the same, just some slight variations here. And then I've changed up some of the drums compared to how it was in the previous drop. Like most of these rides are the ones that were just playing, but I also have a new snare here, as well as a fun little pre-snare that plays every once in a while. And one of the things that you're hearing is this little breath loop that I'm panning left and right. I kind of do a callback to the second half of the first drop, but I mix it in with elements from the first half of the last drop. So we get the same rhythm, but now instead of getting like that growl bass, you get like this pluckier bass. And the way that I made this, it's 2 layers. One of the layers sounds like this, which is essentially this kind of dispersed sounding bass with this filter. That's essentially it, pretty much. And then the other layer, without effects and without the sub, sounds like this. Really does not sound like anything at all, but it's actually going through the exact same processing, at least for the beginning, as that growl bass did. Like I'm bringing in the spectral notches and the format filter, but I'll mute these for now. So if I take these out, it's basically what you heard earlier. I bring in the spectral notches. Completely transforms the sound. The formant filter gives you a bit more of that vowel movement. And then finally I finish it off with the actual low pass filter to make it more plucky. So with the other bass. And I'm also layering it with the ARP that I used to layer the growl in the first drop. But as well as the new ARP from the second drop. And these chords, which I made using you and Bristow's Chameleon X preset for plug data. Same growl as before. But I feel like the theme with the second half of the drop is that it's mimicking the second half of the first drop, but with more like melodic elements and color. So to make it a bit more interesting, I change up the chords in the background. So it sounds like this. And even though this bass is kind of the same, the bass that follows it up is actually the color bass from earlier in the drop, just with some of the layers that I used in the original bass. And then this part is more or less the same as before, but what's really funny about this next part is, I didn't even talk about this bass in the first drop, but if you remember, I have this little bass fill here, which if you're curious how I made this, let me break this down while I'm on the topic of it. Sub drop, and then for the actual main sound, guess which plugin is doing all of the magic? If I turn this off, just a wavetable that you filter in, but you go in here, it's filter table. The mega squelch wavetable, take a listen. All of the movement is just coming from this filter table, and I'm just modulating both the mix and the wavetable position. But now for the second time around, I use the same sound, but there's one small difference. If you didn't catch it, it's this guy here. Which, if you're not already recognizing, is the My PC meme video, if you're familiar with that. This is literally how I felt when making this remix, if you guys know, so I felt like I just had to include this so that it could have its little place in the remix. So now that's there. I feel like it's just subtle enough to where I wouldn't be surprised if you never even noticed it at all when listening to the full remix, but hopefully now that I pointed it out and I play the full thing, it's a lot more obvious. Then, you know, I just make some slight changes to these chords for variation. Like, for instance, adding the fun little sound from earlier, as well as some variations to the bass, making it a bit more powerful. And then, again, the pitch slide for the variation in the second half. And then similar color bass as earlier. And then the rest is more or less the same as it was either earlier in this part of the drop or in the first drop. So then we finally move on to the last part. I simplify the lead to make room for the new lead that I introduced. So now the lead playing the original melody just sounds like this. It doesn't have all of the layers that this one did, so that it's kind of tucked away a bit more in the background and isn't as much of the focus anymore. Because now, this new lead is the focus. I really wanted to have a lead solo to end off the remix, so that's exactly what I'm doing here. And as far as the lead itself, there are two different layers. One of the layers is this lead from earlier in the remix. This one has been playing throughout the remix. Like, for instance, the lead that was doing the harmony earlier in the track is the same patch as this one. And then the other layer is actually a remake of the lead from Far Away by Tristan and Braken that I made for my KOC mix. It sounds like this. So like a very tight saw, only 2 voices of unison with a very low detune, just a little bit of noise, some distortion, chorus, and other processing. That's pretty much it. So those 2 together make the lead. Chords are the same as before. Bass is the same as before. Some slight variations in the bass fills, but nothing too crazy. And the one other little fun thing about this is that for the vocals, I noticed that in the vocal stems, there were some ad-libs that were unused to my knowledge in the original track and the VIP, so I thought, how cool would it be if I could include these vocals somewhere in my remix so that we get vocals from Tasha Baxter that just don't appear in the original track. And what was really convenient is that this last part of the vocal already lined up with what I had written for the lead solo before I had even thrown it in. Take a listen. And then I ended off with just, the bright piano and the bells playing some notes. As well as all of these effects to take us to the outro as well. Ambience. And then, of course, I gotta end it off with the piano playing what might be my favorite part of the entire original track is that melody. And then just slowing it down towards the end like you hear there. But yeah, that's just about everything. I mean, like I said, I didn't go through every single detail, but hopefully you guys enjoyed. Thank you guys for watching. And huge thank you to those of you who have listened to and supported the remix, because this was a huge amount of time that I spent, cooking up this ginormous project file. So it's really awesome to see you guys enjoying this. So thank you. And I think that's about everything I have. So take care, everyone, and I'll see you next time.